Seems like old times, dinner dates and flowers. Look at you. Seems like old times.
The tragedy of Diane Keaton. She made eccentricity elegant, transformed awkwardness into quiet strength, turned oversized suits and fedoras into fashion statements that would influence generations. Diane Keaton didn't just break Hollywood's mold, she refused to acknowledge it existed in the first place. On October 11, 2025, the world lost an icon. Diane Keaton, the Oscar-winning actress who redefined what it meant to be a woman in Hollywood, passed away at her home in California at the age of 79. She leaves behind a legacy far more complex than her signature laugh and oversized glasses might suggest. But this isn't simply the story of a beloved actress who graced our screens for over 5 decades. This is the story of a woman who battled demons behind the scenes, who once consumed 25 bottles of wine a week, who fought bulimia for years in silence, who loved deeply but was never chosen in return. A woman who stood by controversial friends when the world turned away, who adopted children after 50 and never let anyone call her wife. So why did Diane Keaton never marry? How did she become a cultural icon by rejecting everything Hollywood expected of her? And what can we learn from a woman who spent her entire life choosing herself, even when it meant standing alone? This is the story of Diane Keaton. Not just the actress, but the woman who showed us that authenticity is the ultimate rebellion. The making of an original. She was born Diane Hall on January 5, 1946 in Los Angeles, California. The eldest of 4 children, she grew up in a conservative Catholic household where traditional roles seemed carved in stone. Her father, Jack Hall, was a civil engineer and real estate broker. Practical, methodical, reliable. Her mother, Dorothy, was a homemaker with artistic dreams that never quite found their stage. Dorothy Hall had once won the title of Mrs. Los Angeles, a contest that judged mothers on their homemaking skills, their ability to bake the perfect chocolate cake, to maintain the spotless home. To young Diane, watching her mother accept that crown was a moment of profound contradiction. Here was a woman capable of so much more, radiant in her brief moment of recognition, yet destined to return to a life of quiet service. That image haunted Diane for years. She saw her mother's unfulfilled potential, the writer and artist buried beneath expectations of what a wife and mother should be. It planted a fear that would shape her entire approach to relationships. The terror of disappearing into someone else's life, of sacrificing her voice to serve another's story. Years later, Diane would say, "I watched my mother give up her dreams, and I promised myself I would never do the same. Even if it meant being alone, finding her voice." When Diane moved to Manhattan in the late 1960s to pursue acting, she discovered that another Diane Hall had already claimed that name with the Actors Equity Association. Without hesitation, she chose her mother's maiden name, Keaton. It was more than a practical decision. It was a declaration of independence, a signal that she would be the one they remembered. Standing 5 feet 7 inches with expressive brown eyes and an unmistakably offbeat charm, Diane immediately stood out in a sea of conventional beauty. In 1968, she landed her first Broadway role in the revolutionary musical Hair, a production famous for its full-cast nude scene at the end of Act 1. When offered an extra $50 to participate in the nude scene, Diane refused without hesitation. It wasn't about modesty or prudishness, it was about boundaries. She would perform, but she would not conform. That small act of defiance spoke volumes about the woman she was becoming, someone who understood that every compromise was a choice, and she intended to choose carefully. The meeting that changed everything. That same year, destiny introduced her to a neurotic, brilliant writer-director named Woody Allen. Their connection was immediate, intellectual, emotional, and artistically profound. When Allen cast her in his play Play It Again, Sam, some worried about the height difference. She was 2 inches taller than him. But when Diane opened her mouth and delivered her first lines, every concern evaporated. She won a Tony nomination for that performance, but more importantly, she found her artistic soulmate. Their brief romantic relationship would evolve into a creative partnership that spanned decades. Allen understood what others missed. Diane wasn't trying to be a typical star. She was something entirely different, something authentic in a world of artifice, The Godfather and Hollywood recognition. In 1972, Francis Ford Coppola made a casting choice that many considered risky. For the role of Kay Adams in The Godfather, he chose the relatively unknown Broadway actress with the quirky charm. Coppola saw what he needed: vulnerability wrapped in quiet strength, a femininity that didn't beg for attention but commanded respect. The Godfather didn't just immortalize Marlon Brando and Al Pacino. It quietly introduced Diane Keaton as an indispensable presence in cinema. Her portrayal of Kay, the woman promised a life far from crime but trapped in Michael Corleone's shadow, became the moral center of an amoral world. In The Godfather Part 2, her character's devastating confession that she had an abortion rather than bring another child into Michael's world remains one of cinema's most powerful moments. Not through violence or dramatic speeches, but through quiet defiance. That scene, ending with Michael silently closing the door in her face, captured the human cost of power like nothing else in film. Annie Hall and cinematic immortality. If The Godfather was her launchpad, then Annie Hall was her coronation. Originally titled Anhedonia and running over 2 hours in its first cut, the film was a sprawling experiment that seemed unfixable. Through meticulous editing, Woody Allen crafted it into a focused, revolutionary romantic comedy. But perhaps the film's most enduring impact came not from its script, but from its wardrobe. Diane didn't dress according to costume notes. She brought her own style to the role. Oversized shirts, slouchy trousers, vests, fedoras, loose ties. When Allen initially objected, Diane held her ground. The result was a fashion revolution that made androgyny aspirational. Annie Hall swept the Academy Awards, winning Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Actress for Diane. More than that, it established her as a cultural icon. A woman who made awkwardness magnetic and showed that being different wasn't a flaw, but a gift. The battles behind the beauty. But behind the laughter and the accolades, Diane fought battles the public never saw. At just 19, when asked to lose 10 pounds for a role, she began a 5-year struggle with bulimia. The stage demanded perfection. She gave it pain. Entire pies, loaves of bread, buckets of fried chicken consumed in desperate binges, followed by purging in shameful silence. The drinking came later. At her worst, she was consuming 25 bottles of wine a week, not for glamour, but for escape. The pressure of being seen, but not truly known, of being celebrated while fighting private demons, drove her to seek numbness in a bottle. These weren't character flaws, they were survival mechanisms in an industry that demanded perfection while offering little support for the human beings beneath the spotlight. Love without marriage. Then there were the men. Warren Beatty, Al Pacino, Woody Allen. She loved them all deeply, earnestly, completely. But none of them chose her in the end. She never married, never wore the white dress, never walked down the aisle that so many expected her to traverse. "I didn't want to give up my independence," she would later explain. "I didn't want to become someone else's version of me." It wasn't fear of commitment that kept her single. It was fear of disappearance, the same fear planted by watching her mother's dreams fade in service of others. Her relationship with Al Pacino, which began during The Godfather Part 2, was particularly intense. They lived together, traveled together, seemed destined for marriage. But when the moment came for that final commitment, Diane chose herself instead. Years later, she would reflect without regret, "I loved him, but I loved me more." Motherhood, on her own terms. At 50, when Hollywood typically begins forgetting its leading ladies, Diane made perhaps her most radical choice. She adopted her first child, daughter Dexter, followed later by son Duke. She became a mother without a partner, a parent without a blueprint, and she never apologized for it. "I waited until I was ready," she said. "Not ready for someone else, but ready for myself, to love someone completely without losing who I was." Her children became her greatest joy and her proudest achievement, proof that family doesn't require traditional structures, just unconditional love. The Keaton legacy. Throughout her career, Diane continued choosing roles that celebrated complex women. Baby Boom, Father of the Bride, Something's Gotta Give. Films that showed women could be strong and vulnerable, successful and flawed, independent and loving all at once. She defended Woody Allen when others distanced themselves during various controversies, not because she agreed with everything, but because loyalty mattered to her. She believed in nuance, in complexity, in the idea that people are more than their worst headlines. She aged without apology, laughed without restraint, lived without regret. She made oddness magnetic, made awkwardness feel like armor, made being different look like destiny. The final chapter. In her final years, Diane continued working, her last film appearance coming in 2024's Summer Camp. Friends reported that her health declined suddenly in recent months, but true to form, she kept her struggles private. Even in illness, she maintained her independence, her dignity, her choice to control her own narrative. On October 11, 2025, surrounded by her children Dexter and Duke, Diane Keaton took her final bow. She was 79 years old and had spent every one of those years being unapologetically herself, a life well chosen. So why did Diane Keaton never marry? Because she understood something many of us forget, that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. She didn't need a wedding to feel complete, a husband to feel worthy, or society's approval to feel valuable. She chose herself again and again, and in doing so, she became something rare in Hollywood, a woman who aged gracefully because she had lived authentically. Her story isn't just about staying single, it's about staying true. In a world that constantly tells us we're not enough, not young enough, not perfect enough, not conventional enough, Diane Keaton stood as living proof that being exactly who you are is not just enough, it's everything. She leaves behind more than films or fashion statements. She leaves a blueprint for authenticity, a reminder that the loudest impact often comes from the quietest voice, and proof that sometimes the greatest love story is the one you write with yourself. Thank you, Diane, for the laughter, for the honesty, for the courage to be different. You didn't just act, you inspired. And that, more than any award or accolade, is the mark of a true icon. Rest in peace, knowing you lived exactly as you chose, boldly, authentically, and entirely on your own magnificent terms.